Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richard here, welcome back to the channel. This is the last lens review of this year, and for this review we are looking at the new Laowa Argus 45mm f/0.95 lens. Okay, let's start this review by looking at the design and build quality of this lens first. If you have previously watched my Laowa Argus 35mm f/0.95 review, you may find a lot of things that I'm going to say is very similar, because this Argus 45mm lens is indeed very similar to the Argus 35mm lens when it comes to the design and build quality. So this Argus 45mm f/0.95 lens is a fully mechanical, fully manual lens that is designed for full frame mirrorless cameras. The lens is available for Sony E, Canon R, and the Nikon Z, which is the one I'm holding right now. The lens body is fully made of metal, and it is a pretty large and very heavy lens. The weight of this Nikon Z version is over 900 grams. The focus ring is at the front of the lens. It's a pretty large focus ring, and the focus ring itself feels very smooth, very well dampened. And just like the previous Argus lens, the focus throw of this Argus 45mm lens is also quite long. It is around 300 degrees. There is a mechanical aperture ring near the lens mount, and there is a switch on the side here for you to switch between whether the aperture ring has clicks or is declicked. I definitely love it, and I think this is a feature all the fully manual, fully mechanical lenses should have. The lens comes with a removable metal lens hood, and the front filter thread of this lens is 72mm, just like the 35mm Argus lens. Overall, this lens feels extremely solid and extremely metal, and the build quality is also a bit better and feel more refined compared to most other fully mechanical lenses from China. The minimum focus distance of this Laowa lens is 50 cm, which is about average, and the maximum magnification ratio is 0.12 times. So it probably is not the best lens for taking close-up photos of small objects, but it is okay for taking close-up portrait photos. Okay, now let's have a look at the center image sharpness. This is the photo that I've shot at f/0.95. Let's zoom in the center. The contrast and sharpness are both a little bit low, but if you are taking portrait photos, I think you probably wouldn't mind at all. Stop down the lens to f1.4. There is already some big improvement in both sharpness and contrast. Once you stop down to f2, the center sharpness becomes really good. And now let's have a look at the corner sharpness. At f/0.95, the corner is really quite soft. Stopping down the lens to f2, the corner becomes noticeably better. And by the time I stop down to f4, the corner becomes pretty sharp. With its super fast f/0.95 aperture and 45mm focal length, it's really easy to dissolve the background and create some foreground-background separation with this 45mm Argus lens. When shooting some close-up portrait photo, it can melt the background completely. The transition at the edge of the bokeh is soft, not nervous at all, so you could create some very nice dreamy bokeh. At the maximum aperture, I noticed there is a bit of bokeh clipping near the edge of the frame, and there is a little bit of cat's eye effect. When stopped down to f2, most of the clipping effect would disappear and the bokeh balls become very round, even at the corner of the photo. And even when I stop down the lens further, the bokeh balls still remain very rounded. There is a small amount of onion pattern in the bokeh, but it is really quite minor and not really noticeable in most of the photos. And I want to mention one quite interesting thing. I was watching some videos the team from Laowa shot with this lens, and I noticed in one particular scene there is a very special effect. It's a very short clip. It's like there are some multi-layer bokeh effect in this scene, so Not too sure how this was shot, but it looks really dreamy and it looks very cool. Let's have a look at the distortion, and as usual, look at my brick wall test photo. Even though this is not a Laowa COD lens, but the amount of distortion with this lens is pretty minimal. I see a tiny amount of distortion, but it is really quite minor, and I think it shouldn't be even noticeable for most kind of photos. When shooting at the maximum aperture, vignetting is pretty strong, quite noticeable. Not just a test photo, but even the real world photo, you can see the pretty obvious vignetting. But that is not really unexpected for a f/0.95 lens. Stopping down the lens would gradually reduce the amount of vignetting, and at f2.8 vignetting becomes quite minor. But while vignetting is strong, I personally don't really mind for this type of lens, as I think vignetting adds a bit of character to the photos. Chromatic aberration control with this Laowa 45mm lens is alright. There is some small amount of color fringing in some of my high contrast photos, but even when shooting at f/0.95, I don't see any really nasty color fringing, so I feel Laowa did a pretty decent job controlling the chromatic aberration with this 45mm Argus lens. When I'm shooting with this lens, especially when shooting at f/0.95, I notice quite often I would get a bit of lens flare, and contrast can also drop a bit as well when there is a light source in front of the camera. But one thing is, lens flare is not always bad, at least that's what I think. I remember when I reviewed the Laowa Argus 33mm f/0.95 lens, that's the APS-C Laowa Argus lens. That lens has a lot of lens flare, but I love it. I love it because the lens flare looks really nice and very cinematic. So I was actually a bit disappointed when I reviewed their first full frame Argus 35mm f/0.95 lens, as that lens doesn't have those cinematic looking lens flare. But this time with this Argus 45mm f/0.95 lens, this cinematic lens flare is back. It is not as intense as the Argus 33mm lens, not as easy to get those lens flare, and the effect is a little bit more subtle. But with a strong light source in front and just outside the frame, you can still produce it, and I love that effect. And it seems the closer the focus distance you set the lens to, the more that orange lens flare you can create. So it's great if you want to take some close-up portrait photo with a bit of lens flare at the corner of the frame that makes the photo looks fantastic. With this Laowa 45mm Argus lens, when I stop down the lens to around f5.6, I can start to see Sunstars in the photo. But probably because the aperture rays are all optimized for bokeh rather than Sunstars, the shape of the Sunstars doesn't look very nice to me, even when I stop down the lens to the minimum aperture f16. When taking photo at the maximum aperture f/0.95, Coma can be quite noticeable. I wouldn't say it is terrible. I would even say for a f/0.95 lens, it is pretty decent. But still, if you zoom into the photo and look at the corner of the photo, you can see Coma quite easily. And at f2.8, Coma becomes quite minor. For filmmakers, you will love the long focus throw, which allow you to do very precise focus pulling, and you also love the option to make the aperture ring declicked, so you can have good manual control of this Laowa lens. And you will probably also love the cinematic lens flare that this lens can render. However, the focus briefing is a bit more than what I expected. When I do my usual 1 meter to infinity focus briefing test, look at the brick wall on the left, the amount of focus briefing is really quite noticeable. I remember not too many years ago, there were only a very limited number of f/0.95 lenses in the market, and most of them were designed for smaller sensor cameras. So it was a big news when a company released a new f/0.95 lens. But nowadays, f0.95 lens is getting more and more common. Just this year, this is already the 8th f0.95 lens that I reviewed. Even full-frame f0.95 lens like this Laowa Argus 45mm f0.95 is getting pretty common. In fact, half of the 8 f0.95 lens I reviewed this year are for full-frame cameras. So manufacturer really has to do something extra to make their f0.95 lens stand out. And I think Laowa did exactly that with this 45mm Argus lens. It is definitely not the sharpest lens that I've ever reviewed, especially the corner sharpness is quite poor at maximum aperture. But this is kind of expected, and this is probably the last thing I care about a lens like this. If I want a sharp lens, I would usually pick a f1.8 or f2 lens. Those lenses are usually much sharper as it is much easier to design a well-balanced f1.8 or f2 lens. In my opinion, if I want to buy a lens like this, I want to be able to capture photos that a f1.8 or even a f1.4 lens can't do. And I'm not just talking about the super shallow depth of field at f0.95. The rendering need to have some special character, and this Laowa 45mm Argus lens can definitely deliver that to me. The bokeh is soft, and the lens flare is very cinematic, and overall the image captured by this lens just look very pleasing to my eyes. I understand the long focus flow is to allow more precise focus adjustment, but in my opinion 300 degrees seems to be a little bit too long. The biggest downside of this lens is probably the weight. It is pretty heavy lens. I remember when I first received this lens, the weather wasn't really that good, so I didn't go out and I was just taking some test photos and playing with it here in my room, and my hand feel sore very quickly because the weight of this lens. But hopefully the nice shooting experience and the beautiful photo and video captured by this lens would make you forget about the weight of this lens.